Great to see you, or I hope it's great to see me tonight, class. We're going to talk about a couple of articles that have to do with the discussion of how values do or do not influence us in our ethical decision making. I also want to give you the opportunity to, I want to have given you the opportunity to read some of the people who I think are the most really important authors in social work who write about ethics. And I'm not saying that this is they are the be all and end all and that you should believe everything. I'm only saying that in volume and in influence, Frederick Reamer and Marion Madison have had an impact at least, on ethics and how ethics is talked about in social work. So that's why these two particular articles. However, before that, because both of them talk about the moral frameworks, I want to remind us what we're talking about when we talk about the moral frameworks. And I'm going to put up a diagram to show you what those are so that you can be reminded of them. All right, so you are reminded then of utilitarianism and of deontology, of rights theory, in particular Rawls, and then of what we're talking about too, which is moral development, and specifically James Rest's work, which are the schematas of moral development, created or developed after Kohlberg's work. And I think it's a much more contemporary understanding of how people develop. Okay, so with that in mind, and knowing that Madison and Reamer both use those frameworks, and we will be using them all throughout the semester, and we will even be using them when we talk more specifically and examine Gert's common morality. Because remember, Gert asserts that his common morality framework uses both deontology and utilitarianism, although he would always say that he faulted on the side of deontology because he's much more attuned, he says, with deontology than with utilitarianism. Some of his biggest critics, remember, don't say that. They say, in fact, he's quite utilitarian. So this is all the kinds of things that we'll figure out as the semester goes on. But back to Madison. Okay, what Madison is asserting is that we are influenced. She is saying that we, in social work, are hugely influenced by values and by loyalties. In fact, she says that among all of the professions, we are more prone to being influenced by values than anybody else. Now, I think we've talked about this to the extent that you know that I would come down on another side. I would say that in social work, we really are not any more influenced than anybody else, certainly not than any other profession, and I think even we're no more influenced by values than the guy out on the street. We are all influenced by values. What our work in social work is to understand what our values are, but also then to use to use a more rational understanding of how ethical problems are framed and how ethical problems are solved, or how ethical dilemmas are at least managed. Every problem really doesn't have a solution, unfortunately. I wish it did, but it doesn't. So she says that because the center of our work is relationships, that somehow that makes us like softer than other professions. That and mostly she likes to compare us. Everybody likes to compare social work to medicine. If there's any profession that we want to emulate, I suppose it's medicine, and I think it is, especially when you look at contemporary social work and how medically driven it is, and how hugely important the medical model really is, probably more important than it's ever been. But I mean, certainly as social workers, and you've heard this in your classes, that we want to be driven by evidence, that we don't want to be simply a profession driven by something soft out there that has to do with how we feel about people. My assertion is this, and I think this is borne out in the literature, is that just because our work is centered in relationships, that doesn't mean it's not scientific. And it doesn't mean that we can't even do some predictions about the importance of relationships. So what she says, and I think is confusing for us, is that because the center is relationships, that somehow makes us more value-driven than other professions. And I'm saying that just because our relationships are the center of our work doesn't mean that it's any less, that we have any less need for evidence, or that we aren't also scientific and rational. So, so she gives a pretty, lengthy argument about that. She also talks about how we are driven by competing loyalties. Now that is a very deeply personal thing, loyalties are, and I think that is something that if we look at the literature that we've examined to some extent about how we do have to know who we are and what our worldview is in order to sort through in a rational way ethical problems, I think figuring out what your loyalties are is probably part of that process. I think, again, what I'm going to criticize Madison on is that she sort of overemphasizes that. And I think those are things that can be solved, that can be intellectually solved by us as we learn to be social workers. Now, she also, in the article, talks about the frameworks, the moral frameworks of utilitarianism and deontology. And she talks about some big questions, like the question about self-determination, or we talk about it in principalist language as autonomy. The conflict between autonomy and the social or community well-being. When do you choose which side to go on, and how do you ethically make those choices between community or autonomy? And there are a lot of interesting examples about that can illustrate this. And in a couple of seconds, we're going to talk about some of those examples.